Welcome to DMM Downloads. We are podcasting another conversation about DMM between Jeff Crabtree and me, Rudy Rivera. Jeff and I are teamed together in Northern Colorado in a ministry we call DMM NOCO. DMM NOCO is unleashing disciple-making movements in Northern Colorado, and we thought it a good idea to start a podcast as a way to bring awareness and resourcing to ordinary people who are passionate about making multiplying disciple makers in our natural networks. Thanks for joining us in this journey. We hope you get a DMM download from this conversation. Well, hey, Jeff.
Rudy.
How are you today? We've not been talking as long today, but how are you?
Today's not Thursday morning. We had to have some other commitments on Thursday, so we're doing it on a Tuesday. Not that our listeners care, but welcome to Tuesday if you're listening.
It'll probably release later in the week anyhow. And Thursday we're going together, or maybe we need to talk about that, but do some ministry work.
Northern Colorado, some younger college people who have a real missional heart are trying to get some people together in the same space to collaborate. So you and I have been invited, and we're going to head over there.
Yeah, which I'm excited for. I think you know this. I really worked in primarily college ministry context for 25 years, so it's really fun to kind of think about getting it back in touch there a little bit. But today we wanted to revisit basically last week's conversation that we opened up regarding deconstruction and some of the pushbacks we get with DMM in general. And I know for me, well, I don't know if you got the email from New Generations about the prayer summit coming up in September. But I know for me, it got me thinking, like, yeah, we've been leaning into DMM for years now here in Northern Colorado. But of course, globally, this is a lot longer process in the heart of God for disciple making through his church around the globe. And I was thinking about how, again, I keep coming back to North America. I think as North Americans, there's just a growing awareness, but also practice of DMM habits and principles and life. And it just got me thinking, as more people are leaning in, and we were just talking about that, how many people we've met recently here in Northern Colorado who have various forms of DMM. As more people are leaning in, what are the pushbacks that we hear? What are the pushbacks that we get? And then also, what are some of the kind of counter pushes, if you will? Because we've been trying to practice and learn for years now. And as you practice, you do learn. You do make a lot of mistakes, and you do see some of the nuances that are maybe different in our context than maybe other contexts at times. And yet, there are still things that I think we've learned enough about that we'd like to at least dialogue on. We're not saying we have all the answers, but a few of the things that you and I have been talking about are like a pushback against DMM, probably primarily from North Americans, has to do with it's just about chasing numbers or rapid growth or, that kind of thing. Maybe there's an element of like it downplays the teaching gift or, what is it doing about the pulpit of our churches, Maybe the idea of discovery over like a teaching, back to teaching, like it puts the Bible in the hands of ordinary Christians. Do you get heresies? The decentralization of the organization. So what do you do with authority and accountability and even biblical terms like eldership and deacons? And is it legalism? Because we're just asking people to obey. It's always about obedience, And then even we mentioned last time, just deconstruction of Christianity. Is it going as far as ripping everything to shreds? And anyhow, so we just thought we'd revisit the idea of the pushbacks on DMM. And from two guys that are just trying to learn and practice and see what God is doing here in Northern Colorado. So, Jeff, make some sense of that for us.
Well, yeah, I think I mentioned briefly last time. Anytime there's change or a different paradigm, we're probably not going to just accept it at face value immediately. It takes time. And my own journey and story was when I got exposed nearly 9 years ago to DMM. I had pushback.
Yeah,
I
me
had
too.
questions. I had been schooled and trained for a long time, nearly 40 years in the Western church tractional model, legacy model, whatever we want to call it. So again, we don't see pushback concerns as bad unless it stops you from leaning in, exploring, asking God. And so that's what we just say is that we thought we'd bring it up because as DMM gets more exposure in a North American context, and it is, it's growing pretty rapidly, far and wide, north, south, east to west in North America. It's now on the playing field, if you will. We have a place at the table to speak in regard to Christianity. That's important for me to speak to our listeners because they're probably going to hear that and maybe even feel that.
Sure.
So, the one that we often hear, I think, is that because there's globally in the global south, the amount of numbers, this rapid multiplication of disciples, and you're hearing these crazy numbers. I know even in new generations, and don't hold me to the exact number, but in the last 25 or 30 years, I think there's 2.5 to 3 million new baptized believers. That's pretty large numbers. And so they say, oh, well, you're just chasing numbers. And so that's a concern. Maybe rightly so. I don't think we ever are totally pure. But I would first say there's a lot of maybe pushbacks that I would put is, what Western church do you know that isn't seeking numbers? And again, seeking numbers can be bad or it can be good in the sense of that we leave the 99 to go for the one. That's the heart of God. So I would just say the reality is God wishes no man to perish, all to come to a knowledge of the truth. So seeking rapid multiplication of disciples seems to fit into the heart of God, seems to fit into the scriptural reality. Now, our motive, we might obviously have to put that under the microscope and ask the Spirit of the Lord to check us. But I think a pushback like, well, we don't like DMM, or we're concerned about DMM because all you're concerned about is numbers. Well, you might want to take that up with the Lord because He's interested that no man perish. So before we go on, what are your thoughts? Because you've heard the same thing, is that it's all about the numbers, because we're having this crazy harvest, seems like it, especially in the global south. So what do you think is valid? What needs to be put under the microscope? What needs to be sifted so that we can, if you will, avoid the flesh and the negative, but embrace the heart of God and the positive, that we see all men come to the knowledge of the truth?
Yeah, I may derail this whole conversation. We might have to re-record. My thought is this, Jeff, and I'm just reacting to kind of what you said and then putting it into a framework from my experience. But I wonder if those of us, and I'm one of these people who grew up in the church growth movement of America, that there was a direct correlation to chasing numbers. I think that's one of the hindsight is 2020 things. We look back and say, were we always chasing the right numbers there, the right ideas? So the scoreboard mentality, or the scoreboard needs to change, or what does it look like to be an attender, a member, an engaged believer, is a disciple maker versus just a pew sitter, so to speak, right? So hopefully this will all make sense. But those of us that grew up with that framework, I think we were put into, and especially looking backwards, put into a system, if you will, of numbers, right? Bigger, better, faster, and all that. And so as we've America's sort of coming out of that a bit, or maybe us DMMers are coming out of that a bit, that era of church, I wonder if we're looking backwards with critique and going, we don't want to do that again. So thus, then when you look across to the global south and you say, well, it's happening there, there's a rejection a bit of that because it says, well, we've already done that here and look what it produced. Right? So I think that's one side of the numbers game. I think the other part could be also, as we look across the global south, we say, well, it's the line. It won't work here, so they're different than us, or the cultures are so different, and thus we're going to chase numbers. It's going to produce strife that doesn't um, get us to the goal, so to speak, because we're just quote unquote so different, or because again, it's just this mixture of like, I don't want to fall back into the same old traps, and yet, I don't. Is this a fair word? Like a bit of like envy or jealousy or like or um, critique of the global South. Well, it works there, but it won't work here, kind of thing. Almost as if to say, let's not go down that road like they're going because it's an inferior church, or maybe there's some level of like we're not the same kind of people. That sounds so nefarious. It's not meant to be, and maybe that's not making any sense. And I feel like I'm going to interrupt myself, so I'm just going to stop there and say, do you have a thought on that?
Well, obviously, we're going back and forth. We're learning, and we're lifelong learners, and so this is not definitive. We have all the right answers. So that's what makes the podcast what it is you and I just get to share it.
I'm just fumbling through today.
Well, I would say, too, is, one of the values in DMM is multiplication.
Mm-hmm.
Rapid multiplication or reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
And we believe that's a biblical idea, it's a biblical term, it's a part of God's nature, and I don't think I understood it as well as now I understand it from being in the movement world a long time. Be fruitful and multiply.
Mm-hmm.
You want to go to Genesis, or you want to go to even the Great Commission, or you want to go to the book of Acts,
mm-hmm.
Or you go to church history, however you want to do that, is that there is an element of thread through there, is that God has wired, hardwired, if you will, the Great Commission
mm-hmm.
to be multiplicative or reproductive.
Mm-hmm.
And so if somebody has 10 kids, does that mean that they're bad rather than 2?
Mm-hmm.
I know that may be not a good illustration, but the point being is that, we want to guard and evaluate and let the Lord evaluate our motive. But it's like in my neighborhood, put a circle around lostness somewhere. So let's just say within the 2 blocks of my neighborhood, do I only want a few,
mm-hmm.
or do I want them all?
Mm-hmm.
Now I don't get to determine all of that,
mm-hmm.
and there might not be persons of peace, but I want all
mm-hmm.
of my neighborhood to come to know Him.
Mm-hmm.
So, am I chasing numbers, or am I chasing with the heart of God the souls that are around? So we think there is some validity to a pushback. The DMM seems to be so focused on numbers and rapid reproduction and multiplication. Granted, we own that. We take that before the Lord. At the same time, we're going to be passionate that we want all men to come to a knowledge of the truth.
And the numbers, when you were sharing your intro, I think for me, the numbers that came to mind, and I'm no expert, but somebody ought to tell us what these numbers are. You might know what they are. The hours one can go without food, water, shelter. There's when you think about like you're lost in the woods or something, there are hard numbers, like scientific numbers. I think it's like 40 days without food, 3 days without water, numbers, right? You think about lostness, this is what came to mind when you were sharing. It's again, if you're like going to rescue somebody physically from peril, from starving in the woods, there are numbers that need to be measured and hit. And if they're not, you actually perish, right? And so in a lost world where people are perishing spiritually, I think it seems appropriate to go after them with a heart of God that you might live. But that just means then we do have to have a way of measuring that, if you will. That's one of my pushbacks is I think there are numbers to that. And then secondly, I'd say, in terms of motives, I agree with you, like checking motives and all of that. But I'm a gardener, and you know that I was actually getting my beds ready for the spring planting, and multiplication is everywhere in the gardening world. it is like natural, and we've talked about this before, but natural into God's design of how things work. And so I don't get to determine if my garlic multiplies at the rate I want to the size I want, but I do know it multiplies. And that's somewhere God does that below the soil of my garden bed. So anyhow, hopefully that makes some sense there. Yeah. Any kind of thoughts as we sort of move towards wrapping up this one? The pushback of on DMM, and then maybe the pushback back to the push.
Yeah, again, we still need to look into the heart of God, the nature of God.
I think it's so key.
Scriptures in regard to this, instead of just narratives,
Mm-hmm.
either our narrative that multiplication needs to happen or people's narrative that we're seeking numbers. We still have to go back. And again, in John 15, it says, "This is how my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit." And again, that could be described. What is that fruit? And that fruit would then multiply.
Mm-hmm.
So we think it's the character nature of God. We believe is His mandate, even the Great Commission.
Mm-hmm.
But we're even in Acts, Acts 1:8, you'll receive power and the Holy Spirit comes on you. You'll be my witnesses, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, uttermost parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
That seems a little bit multiplicative. That
Mm-hmm.
all these disciples were going to go into these new areas, and there was going to be a harvest. Pray to the Lord of the harvest that He'd send laborers plural, into the harvest field, because the harvest, we want it to be plentiful. It is plentiful. It is white. So again, we're willing to have discussion if you're on this and you hear that and you're concerned about us being too focused on numbers. We'd be glad to have conversation.
Mm-hmm.
We're not saying we're right, you're wrong, or vice versa, but we're just saying that some of these pushbacks, investigate them, talk about them, but hopefully they won't keep you from really leaning into being a multiplicative, sorry, it's a hard word sometimes, disciple maker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said, Jeff. Let's end it there. Thanks, Jeff, for that engaging download. In DMM, we like to say that disciples are learners. I know I'm learning a lot from my conversations with you, Jeff. From all of us in DMM NOCO, we hope you got a DMM download from the conversation today. Don't forget to leave this podcast a review wherever you are listening online. If you found this conversation helpful, please head over to our site, dmmnoco.com, where you can find more content for your DMM journey, including a self-paced Habits of a Multiplying Disciple course. The course is designed to give you practical next steps to becoming a DMM practitioner and multiplying disciple maker. You can take that course for free at dmmnoco.com. We will be back next week with another engaging DMM download episode. Until then, may you hear from God through His Spirit and take simple steps of obedience in what you hear.